Hi, everyone. Welcome to the week 2 of the summer term. It's our summer GBM for Drexel AI, Drexel Society of Artificial Intelligence. Today, we're going to be presenting on 3 concepts, and these presentations are coming from members of the Drexel AI community. I will be presenting first on sparse coding. We will have a presentation on generational learning, and then also a presentation on time series forecasting. I'll wait for people to join, and then we can get started. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine.
Good. Welcome. I don't recognize your name. You're new here?
Yeah.
Cool. First time?
Mhm.
Cool. How'd you hear about us?
There was I'm trying to remember what it was. I saw a poster somewhere on another
Okay.
Slack. Yeah.
It's okay. We're just waiting for people to come in.
Mhm.
We're going to have 3 presentations today that will help form the basis of background for our project this term, or at least one of the projects that we're planning on doing. Hi, Alicia.
Hey.
And Stefan, he's here. Andy's here as well.
Hello.
Stefan, I'm pronouncing that correctly, or correct me.
Yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Enough people mess it up, I guess.
I don't really care. In German, it's normally pronounced a different way, so it's whatever.
Okay. So yeah, I started the recording a bit ahead of time, and I already introduced it for all the people watching, online. But we're doing three presentations today on sparse coding, generational learning, and time series forecasting. And then I also have results from, I've 13 responses from the thing I posted last week. We sent out a resume to talk about what people are looking for in the club. So maybe it'll give us some ideas. Cool. Well, we can get started as people trickle in. I'm sure we don't want this to take forever. I will start the presenting with background on sparse coding. Has anyone done sparse coding before? Anyone? Okay. I was hoping Osamu was going to be here because he
Yeah, I was about to say, like,
background. I know.
Osamu knows, yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right, I'll get started. Yeah, so welcome everybody. We're going to start off with one of the 3 main concepts that we're hoping to apply in this term. The first of which is sparse coding. And sparse coding is a really interesting application, really interesting machine learning model that I recently came across when sitting in on Dr. Edwards Kim's presentations and lab meetings. And the idea behind sparse coding is that you want to be able to form some sparse representation of the data. And when we say sparse representation of the data, we mean that we don't want we want to be able to find a representation such that the features that we detect are intelligible. So you can imagine if you had a snapshot of a kitchen table and you have different fruit on that kitchen table, a sparse representation of that table might be such one that encodes pictures of different fruit. So in sparse coding, the formal definition would be to find that sparse representation of an input image, such that you can reconstruct an input image through a combination. Ansh, I think you're unmuted.
Oh, good. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, like I was saying, you're trying to reconstruct an image using a linear combination of the dictionary elements you learn. So in sparse coding, there's that, those are those elements, the dictionary, which would be a series of images that are almost like patches of the input data. So thinking back to like the example I mentioned of a kitchen table with different fruit lying on the kitchen table, you might learn a dictionary such that the elements are just fruit that lie on the kitchen table, or you might learn an element that's a fork. And then you could imagine that you could reconstruct other tables by just patching together those atoms. And by atoms, we just mean dictionary elements. So dictionaries are not necessarily orthogonal. I have that in there, and I was hoping for input from Osamu because I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. But the one thing I did understand is that they may be overcomplete. So yes, welcome.
Oh yeah. So what that means is that
Feel free to add anything.
Yeah, for PCA. Are you familiar with PCA? Yeah, I'm quite sure you are, right? Like one requirement is that every feature is like orthogonal to each other. So each feature kind of like gives a new dimensionality of information. But that's quite a strict requirement for most data stuff. So that's why in sparse coding, it's not necessarily orthogonal.
Yeah.
Same is true for like independent component analysis. For those, they are not orthogonal too. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad we have the expert here. This is the first time I'm ever trying to explain this to a group, but I just realized a picture would help. This is kind of what I was trying to explain with a table example. You have input data and you're learning patches, and then you're forming a dictionary of those patches, and then you're trying to reconstruct the data using a linear combination of those patches. And we call this the dictionary. Each element of the dictionary is called an atom, and the linear combination of those dictionary elements are called the reconstructed image. And then I was saying that, not necessarily orthogonal because, like Osamu said, it's a pretty strict requirement. But typically these dictionaries are overcomplete. So when you think of like a basis for an input image, a basis is complete if such that any like vector can be composed. It can be constructed through a linear combination of other vectors in the basis, but it's overcomplete if when you remove a vector, you can still reconstruct any vector. So there's some sense of redundancy in the dictionary, which is important for making it sparse. Okay. So I want to just define it mathematically, and this was pretty difficult for me to do, but right, you have input data X, which are defined by vectors of where you can have up to, in this case, we have up to K samples. Yeah, so we have input X and we have K inputs. So you can think of these as K samples. And then each input sample I exists in RD. So you can think of this as just each sample has D dimensions. So if we're dealing with a MINTS data set, if we have 100 images, 100, sorry, the MINTS data set is just images of handwritten characters, like stenciled characters. And so 100 characters, K would be 100, and then dimensions I think is 28 by 28, so 784. The dictionary is defined as D, where it exists in D dimensions, same dimensionality of input X, I, and you have N of them. So the dictionary is defined from D1 to Dn, where you have N atoms. The representation is defined as, so we have a representation, we have K representations for R, because you'd want there to be a mapping between X1, R1. So this R1 would be a representation of X1, and that exists in N because we're trying to use all N elements of the dictionary here. And the idea behind any kind of sparse coding problem is we're trying to minimize the reconstruction error. So we're taking the minimum of the difference between our input images subtracted by the dictionary times R. And we're trying to do that in such a way that Ri is sparse, where Ri is a single representation of a given input image. Okay, and I think I'll get into this later, but this is some sort of norm that I'm not exactly familiar with. So I don't know if you remember the name. I have it later, and I think this 2 is a square. It means squared, right?
Yeah, usually I just square it, like
Okay.
square the reconstruction.
Okay.
I'm not sure what else. Yeah.
Yeah, F. Yeah, I'll get into it later, but it's some sort of equation.
Mm.
Cool. Does anybody have any questions on that? This is the first time I'm ever explaining it, so we're here for practice. No, I moved the F. Cool. Okay, so the problem can be broken down into this optimization problem, and there are algorithms that attempt to solve this. And the idea behind this problem that I'll explain is that we want to find D and R simultaneously. And for reasons that I'll explain, you can't exactly do that. You have to do it in an iterative process. And most algorithms the 2 algorithms that I looked into, find them iteratively. So they find D and then they find R, and then they go back to D and go back to R. So we're looking for the minimum, the argmin for D and R, where Ri is still bounded, where each Ri is in that Rn dimension where we have n dictionary elements, and D is in the dimension of C, where C is a constraint, such that basically C, the reason we have C, I have it right here, is a constraint that keeps D from becoming too arbitrarily large for small values of R. So if we have few dictionary elements, we don't want we don't have many if we don't have many reconstructions that we're attempting to build, we don't want the number of dictionary elements to grow massively. We still want to represent the reconstruction. We still want to build the reconstruction from very few dictionary elements. This right here is the same reconstruction error that I had in this previous slide. Instead, you're doing it for each xi and ri. But in addition to minimizing the reconstruction error, you're also penalizing sparsity. So what this norm does is it basically, the lambda is some parameter and you're multiplying it by this L0 norm, which is just, I'm pretty sure it's just the count of the number of non-zero features. So argmin means that we're looking for the sum of this that is at the minimum, where we're looking for the D and the Ri for which the sum is at a minimum, and we're penalizing deviations from xi when we're penalizing deviations of the reconstruction from xi, in addition to penalizing dictionaries that have that aren't sparse. And to kind of explain what sparsity is, you can kind of think of the most sparse representation of a feature would be like a one-hot encoded feature, or if you have D dimensions, you have a single one for any of those for any one given feature, and then the rest of the dimension, the values are 0. That's the most case, and the least sparse representation. The least sparse representation of a feature is that all features in a set are non-zero. This definition of C is not as still doesn't make as much sense to me, but like they mentioned, it's a constraint that keeps D from becoming too arbitrarily large. And I'd like to mention that the lambda parameter, again, it controls the trade-off between sparsity and error minimization. So you're trying to you use a lambda value based off of which one you care about more. So if lambda is small, we care more about minimizing reconstruction error, And if lambda is large, we care more about sparsity. So there was something in the video that talked about convex between like being convex or jointly convex. And it mentioned that this, how it is right now, it isn't convex because of the L0 norm, which is this right here. But if we change it to an L1 norm, that means that C and R become convex, but not jointly convex, which is a problem that they mentioned. Okay, and because they aren't jointly convex, so they're not convex at the same time, when you solve for both of them simultaneously, we have to have an iterative method that tries to solve for D and then solve for R. Okay, and then something I wanted to mention is that if, depending on the values of D and N, where D is the number of dimensions of our input image, and N is the number of dimensions in our reconstructed image, because we have N dictionary elements, we can say something about the algorithm that we employ. So if N is less than D, we are performing dimensionality reduction in addition to dictionary learning, and that's when the dictionary is undercomplete. But in the case where it's overcomplete, when N, the number of dictionary elements, is greater than the input image dimension, we are more interested in sparsity, and we're purely just doing sparse coding. So moving on to this one, this is basically what we're talking about between convex and non-convex, or being jointly convex. So I guess the idea is that in the ideal case, when we're solving for D and for R, they both, solving for both of them results in this convex space. But it might be the case that when we're solving for D and R at the same time, the distribution doesn't lie in a perfectly convex space. So you might have to just solve for D, and then you solve for D in D's convex space, and then you solve for R in R's convex space. Whereas solving for them simultaneously might not have a convex space that you could apply gradient descent on. Okay, so Osama, would you like to add anything?
I think that pretty summarizes it. Kind of like
Okay.
when I implemented sparse coding, one thing that I was confused about was this problem. Yeah.
So is this something related to convex optimization?
I think so. You probably employ some gradient descent algorithm.
Yeah,
I would assume.
Yeah, those two are related.
Yeah. Okay. You said, Osama, this is the thing you understood the least.
Oh, well, I ended up understanding it, but one thing that you always need to do when you do sparse coding and not other deep learning is that for activity, so I call that things that you multiply the dictionary by activities.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's
one
good.
thing
Like
I
the
need to
coefficients.
do, yeah, those ones, RIs and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I need to kind of like do like 300 loops or so on the 300 loops or so to find the best activities.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, finally update the dictionary.
Yeah.
It is quite unique for sparse code.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, thank you. And then I'm not going to go deep into the methods that you use, the methods that I found to solve sparse coding, because I don't explain them. I don't understand them to the degree that I'd want to. But the first method is method of optimal directions, where it uses this equation, which looks like the original equation of sparse coding I mentioned, except it takes out the sparsity parameter from the minimization problem, and it turns it more into a constraint. And it doesn't try to minimize it. It just says that it wants the L0 norm to be less than or equal to T, where T is the number of non-zero elements. It also applies this Frobenius norm, which is, I guess they said it's a standard matrix norm that they imply. I thought that was interesting, so I included it in there. And this algorithm alternates between solving between R using a method known as matching pursuit and updating the dictionary with this equation until the residual converges, which the residual, I'm guessing, is just the difference between the reconstruction and the input data. So that iterative solution falls in line with what we mentioned here, with the fact that solving for D and solving for R isn't a jointly convex problem. The second one is KSVD. And I told you I didn't understand this as well, and I understand this algorithm far less. But I think the idea is that it's taken from the k-means clustering algorithm. And even the k-means clustering algorithm can be described by this, this equation where you have D cluster centers and each sample is represented by a one hot encoded vector. Instead, we've relaxed that by allowing there to be less than or equal to T non-zero elements. And then this KSVD algorithm operates using, first by finding a dictionary or fixing a dictionary, finding the best representation using orthogonal matching pursuit, which is just an adaptation to matching pursuit, which was used in method of optimal directions. And then it iteratively updates the elements of D and SVD after finding R. So in our case, it's still an iterative process. It didn't, in what I looked up online, it didn't mention which one was better for which cases. It says that even this one still suffers from dimensionality, as does like the one I previously mentioned, method of optimal directions. It also suffers from dimensionality, and I forgot to mention here, but sorry. This algorithm is most efficient for low input data. So I'm going to assume that whenever you're trying to do sparse coding in general on high input data, it takes a lot of computational power because of the fact that A, it's iterative, and B, you have to learn a much larger dictionary because of the fact that we want a sparse representation that is overcomplete. Yeah, that is a very, the sparse coding is a very deep topic, and it's pretty difficult to explain from just reading into it a little, like as little as I have. But if you have any questions, like let me know, and Osamu and I can try to answer them. But if there are none, we'll go to, I think, was it, no, and who opted to do, it was Stefan, right?
Yeah, the applications.
Yeah, applications to sparse coding. And this is more relevant to what we want to do this term, because while understanding the theory behind sparse coding is important, it's not always needed because there are plenty of frameworks that do the sparse coding and you just have to interpret it.
All right.
So Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yeah. All right. So, sparse coding applications. This has been a pretty difficult topic for me to look up simply because there are basically only scientific papers about this and not really much else. But I did my best to summarize at least some interesting aspects. And generally, sparse coding is often used for sort of image tasks to extract specific features. Like one example would be you could use it for something called super resolution, where you try to upscale the resolution of an image. And the way you would do that in this case, as far as I understand, is you would have like two separate sparse dictionaries, one for the low resolution, one for the high resolution images. And you try to find the same sort of feature vector for the corresponding image. And that way you get the same feature vector for the low resolution image and the high resolution image, and you can convert between the two any way you want. Another thing I found was some denoising. This paper specifically didn't really fully understand how they did it, but they added some type of constraint to the algorithm to pretty much extract just the features without the noise and like not caring about the noise at all, and then reconstructing them as a non-noisy image. And they did it quite successfully, as you can see in the example images here. But in general, sparse coding, you can pretty much use it anywhere you want to extract features of some sort. So in this case, this is an example where you can do it with audio signals. In this situation, they still convert it to some sort of image representation by converting the audio signal into a spectrogram, which is essentially a plot of frequency in comparison to time. And yeah, you can, since you're doing basically feature extraction from sparse coding, you can also use it for classification if you want to. The way I've seen it is that it's not really it's mostly not used in that regard. A lot of other like typical convolutional networks, for example, are like preferred because they're like way easier. But it is possible, and but the power of sparse coding essentially is that you can find features in an unsupervised way, which isn't something that a lot of other structures can do easily. There are also some examples where it's applied to time series. There is a specific algorithm for called shift invariant sparse coding, which again, I don't really understand, but essentially in describing it in English terms, it is sparse coding, but it uses the basis function for all possible shifts, sort of. So a specific function like a sine wave can be shifted in any way you want it to, and then you can reconstruct things based off of that. For example, that's the way to think about it. And I also looked at how sparse coding has been applied when it comes to work with ECGs, which is what we're kind of like thinking about. I looked at two papers briefly, and both of them, interestingly, took like this sort of approach where they use the intervals between all these different points you see with the P, Q, R, T, the intervals between them, and use those as features, and use those to calculate like even more different metrics, and use them as features as well, and then find a sparse representation of that on top of it. And one paper used it to classify ECGs of patients as either normal, abnormal, noisy, or other, and it did that quite successfully. And the other paper was simply trying to see if you could accurately reconstruct an ECG using these features after you trained them. Yeah, that's all I have.
Cool. No, thank you. That was very well put together. A very good overview of the application. You led into time series forecasting. So maybe Felicia's still with us. She can continue that discussion because you can get a representation of so we're talking about sparse coding. You can get a representation of time series, but you can also do something else with time series. You can also try to forecast it and predict what future values might be.
Yeah, let me share my screen. Wait, hold on. Okay, so I'm gonna be talking a little bit about time series, give like a short overview. So a thing to know about when you're working with for time series is that it's a lot of like time series, like in machine learning, you work with time series a lot more than you think. If you don't know what a time series is, it's a sequence of data points that occur in a successive order during a certain period of time. So an example of that would be, stock prices, ECG readings, which is something that we're looking into, and like weather data, if you look at like hourly weather. So depending on like what it is, a time series is based on like years, quarters, months, hours, minutes, seconds, etc. So this is an example of a time series. I think this graph specifically is like airplane passengers that I saw on a website. So this is a increasing trend. Oh yeah, there are also different trends for time series, like seasonality trends, like if you're talking about like monthly sales, if you like, I don't know, work somewhere in business or such, even like for, I guess for stocks too, depending on like, I guess like for certain occasions, like stocks can like dip really low or like go super high. So time series forecasting is when you're taking your historical data and you're using that to predict, you know, the next points. So what I have here is the same graph I showed before. I think the machine learning model I used was a multi-layer perceptron, but the green is, okay, so the blue is like the original time series. The green would be the training data. So yeah, the green would be the training data, and then the red would have been the forecasted, the predicted time series, the next, you know, time series. So there are two different types of time series forecasting methods. Univariate time series, so that's when you have two variables and only one, besides the time one is used, is like your main focus when you're forecasting. And the next one is multivariate time series forecasting, and that's when there's like multiple variables, and that's where there's like different parameters. And in our case for the ECG, we would be using multivariate, I believe, for that. So like that's something that you should like take consideration about when you're like working with time series, and know what type it is, so you know how to go about it. Some machine learning models that have been used for time series that I've read about or like known in the past, like K-nearest neighbor, for, I know that one has been used for like univariate time series, that type of algorithm. There's been like random forest, gradient booster, convolutional neural networks. I have seen that a lot for time series, especially for multivariate. That can get difficult to use, just like if you don't handle your data well, like pre-processing it well. So when you're working with time series, there are like a few things you should consider. Knowing what your inputs and outputs are, like what the data is providing in your time series, and like what you want to predict out of that. And you also need to know what type of time series you're dealing with, so you know how to handle your data later on. And input variable influences, that is like, you have to know if there are like other variables in your time series that are influencing like your input, and what your output also like depends on. There's a word for that. I forgot the name of it. And there's also something called single step and multi-step forecasting, and that's basically like different time steps that you want to predict. If you want to do one that's single step, you want to do like multiple ones that's multi-step forecasting. Another thing to consider is if you want to use like a regression predictive modeling to solve your forecasting problem, or like a classification type predictive modeling. So if you're going to use a classification one, you have to have like class labels for that. And then if you're going to use the regression one, then that would just forecast, you know, like a numerical value for that. And And handling data is just like how you're going to pre-process it. And I saw a few papers about sparse coding being used for time series. I think it's a good idea only because working with time series is like sort of an avoided thing in machine learning just because some people don't know how to like work with it. Mm-hmm. And the last thing to consider would be your metrics. So like if you're using like a deep learning model, knowing the metrics is important, so you optimize your model enough, and then you get like, you know, accurate enough examples. Like for example, like one of the metrics we can use is like the root mean square error one, or etc. Like anything else like that. So those are like all the things you should know about when you're working with time series for forecasting. So, any questions?
Thank you, Alicia. That was very, very good. So, first of all, does anybody have any questions for Alicia?
Oh, what kind of methods? Do you do like feature engineering when you do time series, or do you like to just put it in like a RNN or whatever?
You can do feature engineering with time series. It's like using feature selection is recommended, just so you can extract your features from your raw data for that. It honestly depends on what type of data you're working with.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So, right. Just thinking, we introduced sparse coding, which is a new unsupervised method to form some reconstruction of data. And we also introduced time series forecasting, which attempts to attempts to basically predict the future, predict this time series like data in the future. So Alicia, you mentioned multi-step and single step. So, you know, obviously single step is the easiest that people have tried to publish papers on, where you just try to predict the next the next data point in time. But you know, we'd like to do multi-step where we can predict like M data points in the future. But one problem that I mentioned last time with, you know, with multi-step, what she called multi-step prediction, is that because it's just the fact that errors tend to sum with prediction. You diverge from the signal you're trying to predict. So if you're predicting like a waveform and you predict M into the future, you might just see that your predictions just like go off in a direction that doesn't make any sense. And it's difficult to determine whether something is diverging because you're predicting time series in the future, so you don't exactly have a reference. But the hope is that if you have a sparse representation, you can use that to compare. So I want to tie this all together with a presentation from Andy, who's going to talk about generational learning, because I think that's the last piece of the puzzle that allows us to use sparse coding in such a way that you can iteratively form a reconstruction and compare it to your predictions until you have predictions that match the representation. So Andy, if you're ready.
All right. So generational algorithms, essentially it's a selection of solutions to be passed on to the next generation, right? And this is until a specific criteria is met, and then with each generation, the program disregards those solutions that don't meet the satisfactory fitness level, as in like the level that we would want to push on to the next generation. And so for my research, right, is also another name for it is in genetic algorithms or evolutionary algorithms. It's sort of like a sublet of that. And it's to simulate real world evolutionary selection using mutation of genes simulated by the machine, and then crossover of 2 genes from the parents, as well as the selection of the best genes for the next generation. So examples of this you can see is with an evolutionary computer that's designing a program for an antenna used by NASA. And you can see the image here of the generated antenna. It is also used for optimization problems like fan blades, building shapes for construction parts. And so the limits is that it might take forever to solve a problem, given that it's generating a different generation throughout in order to meet a certain criteria. And so it's not also designed for yes or no or true or false. But given our problem of like ECG is that it'll work out because we're looking for data points. And so another limit is that it might converge towards a local optima instead of a global optimum of the problem. And so some of these problems can also be lessened through elitism, parallel implementations, and adaptive GAs with adaptive parameters. And so like through these different methods, we can lessen the local optima and sort of reach our satisfactory fitness level. And so looking more closely now, a generative algorithm can be represented through many forms. One such is tree-based. And the steps is really just to follow that we are evaluating each program. And so in the current population and given the data set, and we're determining how well it performed. And then we can record it. It is randomly selecting programs and comparing their fitness scores. And then we apply one of the 3 genetic operators to copy of the leading program, reproduction, mutation, crossover, and we move the program into the subset generation. We evaluate it, and then we just sort of compare the programs and look for to see if any of the programs actually meet our criteria. So in each populations, they're all made of programs, and each program is a math function that's executed with the given data to output a result. With reproduction, the program is copied without modification. Yeah, this is all specifically directly from for each section, right? Reproduction, mutation, crossover. And these are very specific in that it talks about how there's mutations that are randomly modified, and the crossover is as in like 2 programs that sort of share together or combine together to create a new program. And so one image would be essentially one that's actually here. I couldn't really find a genetic programming tree, but I suppose this would be one to look at, right? And then to continue. Another form is generative adversational networks, or GANs, and these are 2 neural networks that are put against each other to produce new syntactic data. This is just another form, and it essentially generates artwork. Well, in this case, it generates an image, in which that's what it's mainly developed for, right? And this is just another way of observing a genetic algorithm. And you can see one piece of artwork through, whoops. Through this one here, that's generated through AI and deep learning. And so to move on, right? So for our specific application, right, ECG within deep learning, we're gonna be using, well, these are the models that I have researched, and I don't really necessarily know the more in-depth sort of coding method, coding or specific logic to it, but these are essentially the models that have been used for generative models before in terms of ECG, okay? Yeah, and these are our sources.
Thank you. Does anybody have any question for Andy? Okay. So yeah, now we have three different. Sorry, Andy. I think it's interesting you mentioned some stuff on GANs because we did stuff with that last term, which kind of flopped, but it was interesting to explore GANs. We did it in protein structure prediction. So that's a three-dimensional structure compared to what it's typically applied on, which is two-dimensional image. Yeah. So you covered a lot of what I hoped you'd cover for generational learning, which I'm happy about. I'm actually going to ask Stefan to share his screen because there was one picture of EEG that I'm going to draw on to kind of illustrate what I had in mind last meeting when this idea struck me and why I asked you guys to all present on these topics, right? So backing up, we have sparse coding, which forms some representation of the data. Sorry, Stefan, can you share your screen? And then go to the EEG, yeah, that one. So we have sparse coding, which forms some representation of the data. So you can imagine that if this was your input data here, you'd form a dictionary where you might have a one element corresponding to the QRS wave right here. You'd have another element corresponding to the T wave, U wave, PR interval, and you'd hope that it would encode all these features in an overcomplete sparse way, such that you could reconstruct this signal. Right, that's the sparse coding element of it. The time series forecasting element of it is, okay, we're asking for these segments right here. You'd want to be able to, reconstruct it in a multi-step manner such that the next time points you construct are legible or intelligible, right? So if we were to simply predict the next point right here, it's very likely that it'll be predicted with high accuracy. But as we predict more and more time, more and more periods in time in a multi-step way, the errors of our previous predictions will add, and our predictions might diverge away from the signal. So I'm not making this as explicit. I'd like to, if we have some sliding window where we use these features right here to predict this time point, this one would be much closer to the actual value that we should predict compared to if we had a sliding window like this right here, and we predicted this time point. Because some of the features for this one right here are based off of what we previously predicted. So kind of what someone else in the club, Molly, said, and he alluded to something I mentioned a while ago, is that this is a low-hanging fruit, because if you can solve this problem, you can effectively do multi-step univariate time series forecasting without the additive effect of errors. Okay, so those are the two pieces of the puzzle. Sparse coding is that representation, which is useful in our case, and then time series forecasting, which is just predicting in the future, and we'd want to do it in a multi-step fashion, where we used our predictions as input as we move a sliding window from left to right, from t equals 0 to whenever. So the power in this comes with generational learning, because you'd imagine you'd have some weights to initialize the time series forecasting, and you might have a set of weights that predict the next m data points, but that multi-step prediction diverges. You might also have another set of weights that the time series forecasting diverges in another direction, right? But there exists, I would imagine, some initialization in which you're closer to what you'd actually expect. So in applying I guess my idea in applying generational learning here is that you can kind of generate a bunch of different instances of time series forecasting by changing the initialization of the algorithm by which you predict these values. And you can use some sort of score to pick and identify that, like, this is the best one, and this is the weights that produce this should be passed on to the next generation, and then you start it over and over and over again. The score function is related to the sparse representation, because we might discover that this orange one cannot be represented well using the dictionary we learned in this input image. It also might be the case that this brown one can't be reconstructed well using the input image. However, there are dictionary elements in the blue one that can be used to reconstruct it. So we would use the dictionary we learned to score each generation of our time series forecast, and that would be used to give birth to the next generation of our forecast. So that's the general idea, and I'm really happy that all y'all presented because everyone offered all of the parts of the puzzle that I wanted to make sure everyone saw. Does anybody have any questions about this idea?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So for ECG, right, we're talking about like a heartbeat of a person,
yeah.
Right? Okay. And then could we also maybe use like averages of like an average, say given like an average 40-year-old male or something?
Yeah.
That.
Yeah. So maybe if you'd want, like, are you talking about like using it as another variable?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like if we have, that's a good question. That'd be a multivariate time series. We'd be doing a multi-step multivariate time series forecast because we're using another variable. So if we know that our patient is 45 years old, we might include as another feature the average heart rate of that person of that age. But we'd have to have data of that person. We'd have to have that average heart rate. But that would be a multivariate prediction. And that's a good point, because right now I'm only thinking in the univariate fashion, because we'd be simply using just these data points as they deviate in time. And you can apply that. I'm pretty sure you can apply time series forecasting to any signal. You can apply, this to this algorithm that I have in my head, or that we presented and talked about today, to any time series. But I think EEG is good because, like we see in this figure here, there are plenty of features hidden that I'm sure we could make some sparse representation that we could use to score time series forecasting, and use a genetic generational algorithm to find the best weights that give rise to that forecasting. And in our example, this blue one would be the closest one because it doesn't diverge like the orange and brown one does. Cool. Okay. So I thought it was interesting also. What was I going to say? Okay. So before we get into building anything, I want to spend next week talking about how to actually formalize all this, because, well, I can come up with it. We can talk about it. We can research on it. We can present on it. We can kind of work out the details together. It makes more sense to almost formalize it. So like I presented those mathematical expressions for sparse coding and those algorithms briefly, I think it's a good practice to it's a good practice to formalize your ideas using some math, which might be exciting to some of you, might not be, but I think that stuff is really cool when you can have it rigorously defined using some mathematical statements. So next week, I think in addition to going over the community response to a form I sent out last week, I'll send it out again so we get more responses. I think that's fair, giving everyone 2 weeks. I'll work with you and show you how I go about formalizing algorithms, because that is an important part in developing new AI techniques. And then, at least I was pretty happy that no one actually brought up this idea in their presentation, because that would mean that we're not doing something novel. But because no one stumbled on this accidentally, we're more certain that this is the first time that any group is going to merge these 3 concepts together. Yeah, Stefan, thank you for sharing your screen. I appreciate all the presentations. I'll be sticking around if you have any questions, but that is it for me. Thank you for joining in, and I'll see you next week.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Good job, everybody.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So how would we like combine all of the algorithms and the equations together? Is it going to be like we input data into one and then we transfer it to another?
Well, you can make a pipeline that does it. You'd want something that people always look for, like, things that they can deploy that are end to end. So maybe in the future we'd focus on deployability, but first off, we're going to try to get a prototype. The first step would be to create that representation of our input image, and the next step would be to set up some sort of framework that you can generate like n different predictions, time series forecasts. And then the third step would be to compare those forecasts, to score those forecasts against our representation. And then depending on which forecast has the best representation to our dictionary, we'd use those in subsequent generations in a genetic fashion. And we'll talk about next week, we'll talk about formalizing that, and then how we can actually start building it in code.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Is there anything we should do to prepare, or should we just wait until the next meeting?
You can just wait. I'll give you a break. I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do. But it'll probably mostly be us. It'll be very interactive next term, less presenting, more interactive, and trying to get you guys to think about how you formalize all of this into math, because that's a pretty important part of the whole research process.
Great. Okay. See ya.
Yep.
Thank you.
See ya. You got it.
Ethan, I was looking into this paper on medical imaging using sparse coding. So can you just tell me a bit about like what is discrete cosine transform and discrete wavelet transform, because it was the 2 main transformations that was using to convert.
Yeah. So okay. So DWT and DWT are just different ways of using things known as wavelets to reconstruct time series data. So you can usually they only use one wavelet at a time, and what a wavelet is just a wavelet is just like a waveform, but that can be compressed and it can be scaled, and they use those wavelets at different scales by like stretching it or expanding it, like changing the frequency or amplitude to reconstruct the image. So like connecting that to sparse coding, that's like if you had one dictionary element, but you could modify it and you can use it to reconstruct the input image. That's the idea between the whole wavelet transform. The difference between CWT and DWT, I don't know off the top of my head, but I would assume that one is continuous and one is discrete, but that's a naive answer. Yeah.
So if you have like some material on the whole sparse coding thing, like if you could send it over, it would be pretty nice.
Yeah, I wasn't able to find like a paper, like I forget who mentioned it, but I wasn't able to find like a paper. Most of my reading is based off of like YouTube, and also
like I found this Stanford's, like I think it's kind of like the encyclopedia or something.
Yeah. I think if you started there, it explains the same. Yeah, it explains the same minimization problem that I presented. But like, sometimes,
go ahead.
I was going to say sometimes in papers they have a background section, and in that background section they have the theory behind sparse coding, and that's often what people use to learn about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was saying that
If I find anything, I'll send it your way.
yeah, like any course or stuff.
Yeah.
Look pretty nice. Like I did the convex optimization course online, and I see like a few parts like pretty similar to it. Like going on to the gradient descent and stuff, it felt pretty similar.
Okay. Cool. Good. I'll send anything that comes my way.
Cool.
Cool.
Okay, then I'll see ya.
See ya.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So I'm new to this club. I joined last term. And I don't really know how things are operate here. So I was just gonna ask, like when we start those projects, like how we put into teams and like stuff like that.
Yeah, so we'll all be working together on this. I don't imagine we'd get into any coding until week 2? I don't imagine we'd get into coding until like week 4. Next week will be pretty collaborative, and we'll work on formalizing the algorithm we're gonna use. Week 4, we'll start to organize tasks via GitHub. Sorry, what's your major?
Software engineering.
Okay, so yeah, okay. We're gonna be organizing tasks into GitHub, and then we'll create notes, and we'll see who wants to do some tasks, and we'll make the tasks small enough that they can be done relatively quickly. And if we have enough people working on the project, then it really shouldn't take too much of anyone's time. And then after the project and we do the code, we get the results, we'll start to write a paper. And then depending on who contributes the most, depending on people's individual contributions to the paper, they'll be put on as authors. And then we'll submit that paper at the end of the term to a couple conferences.
Okay, that sounds good. And then who, hold on. So also, when are we starting this now?
We're going to be formalizing in week 3. When I say formalizing, just making it, mathematical. And then week 4, we'll probably start coding, or probably after the week 3 meeting, we'll start thinking about coding.
Okay. And then what is this, what's the goal of this project too?
Okay. So yeah, the goal of this project is to employ a multi-step time series forecasting algorithm. So if you have a signal of n points, you want to be able to predict the next m points such that the predictions don't diverge. So
okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. But like what can we apply to? Show what I mean. Like is it just any signal?
Yeah. So we are going to do with EEG because we're going to do ECG because of it's pretty. It tends to repeat itself. With small variations. B, a lot of the features are known. So like the QRS wave, the T wave, the P wave, and I'm sure there's plenty of data available online.
Okay, because I wasn't really sure how what it could be used for. I guess any signal. So
any signal.
Like if you had like a sound wave, you could basically just continue it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I get it.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. Sounds good. See you later.
See ya.